People often say that Barry Goldwater is Messiah of the switch, i.e. the man who made the Republican Party racist, but he had many views that liberal Democrats would agree with, i.e. he didn't like religion in politics and he was for abortion.
It's true that Barry Goldwater's views were complex and didn't necessarily fit neatly into either the conservative or liberal camps. While he is often seen as a key figure in the Republican Party's shift to the right, it's important to note that his opposition to civil rights legislation, including the 1964 Civil Rights Act, was a significant factor in his loss to Lyndon B. Johnson in the 1964 presidential election. In terms of his views on religion and abortion, Goldwater was a strong advocate of individual liberty and limited government, which often put him at odds with social conservatives in his own party. He believed that government had no business interfering in personal matters such as religion or reproductive choices, and he often clashed with fellow Republicans who wanted to use the power of the state to enforce their own moral and religious beliefs. So while Goldwater's views on civil rights were certainly problematic, his broader political philosophy was more nuanced and didn't necessarily fit into the conservative or liberal camps of his time.
His view against civil rights, I believe, was not that he opposed them on a state-by-state level, but that he was against a monolithic top-down reassortment of it.
Barry Goldwater did oppose the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was a federal law that prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Goldwater's opposition to the Civil Rights Act was rooted in his belief in states' rights and limited government, rather than any objection to civil rights themselves. Goldwater's argument was that the Civil Rights Act violated the principles of states' rights and limited government by imposing federal regulation on private businesses and property owners, which he saw as an overreach of federal power. He believed that the issue of civil rights was best left to the individual states to decide, rather than being dictated from the federal level. Goldwater's opposition to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not necessarily make him a racist or a supporter of segregation, but it did align him with many white Southern Democrats who also opposed the law for similar reasons. However, Goldwater also faced criticism from many other Republicans who disagreed with his stance on civil rights, and his opposition to the Civil Rights Act is not generally considered to be the sole or primary cause of the shift of the South from the Democratic to the Republican Party.
It seems, though, a bit hypocritical because that is what Jim Crow laws did. Jim Crows imposed racist views onto business owners who may have been more friendly to blacks, or at the very least would have done business with them for the right amount of money.
Yes, that's a good point. Jim Crow laws were a form of top-down government intervention that forced businesses and individuals to comply with racist policies. These laws often imposed severe penalties on individuals who violated them, such as fines, imprisonment, or even physical violence. So many business owners and others felt they had no choice but to comply. This was a major factor in the persistence of racial discrimination in the South and elsewhere, and it was a significant obstacle to progress towards civil rights for African Americans.
So, it seems a bit inconsistent to support states' rights when it comes to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but not to Jim Crow laws.
Yes, that is a common criticism of the argument for states' rights in the context of civil rights. It is often seen as a way to defend discrimination and segregation, rather than as a genuine commitment to the principle of federalism. The federal government's intervention in civil rights issues was necessary to ensure that all citizens had equal protection under the law and to counteract the systemic racism and discrimination that had been institutionalized in many states. Arguments for states' rights in this context can be seen as an attempt to maintain the status quo of inequality and injustice.
People say that the reason why Jim Crow laws began in the North and not the South was because in the South slaves were simply too much of a part of day-to-day life in order to be fully separated from other whites. Whereas in the North, where they didn't have as many blacks and didn't have slavery, they could afford to separate the races more easily.
The origins of Jim Crow laws are complex and multifaceted, and there is no single factor that explains why they began in the North rather than the South. However, one factor that is often cited is the presence of large numbers of black migrants in northern cities during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which caused anxiety and resentment among many white residents. This led to the passage of laws and policies that were designed to segregate and marginalize black residents, such as residential segregation, school segregation, and employment discrimination. Another factor that contributed to the rise of Jim Crow laws in the North was the influence of white supremacist organizations, such as the Ku Klux Klan, which had a strong presence in many northern states. These groups used violence and intimidation to enforce racial segregation and discrimination, and they had significant political power in many northern cities. It's also worth noting that while slavery was abolished in the North before the Civil War, many northern states had discriminatory laws and practices that restricted the rights and opportunities of black residents. For example, many northern states had black codes that limited black people's access to education, voting, and property ownership. These laws and practices helped to create a climate of racism and segregation in the North that contributed to the rise of Jim Crow laws in the 20th century.
Thomas Dartmouth Rice is the New York man who made the namesake of Jim Crow a thing. The North had racist legal codes that were adopted by the South.
Yes, Thomas Dartmouth Rice is known for popularizing the minstrel character Jim Crow in the early 19th century, and the term Jim Crow later became associated with the segregation laws and practices that developed in the South after the Civil War. However, as you mentioned, the North also had its own racist laws and practices. For example, many northern states had black codes that restricted the rights of free black people and segregated them in public places. Additionally, some northern cities had de facto segregation, with black people being concentrated in certain neighborhoods and excluded from other areas. It was not until the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century that legal segregation was challenged and dismantled across the country.
People often associate states' rights with slavery in the South, but that isn't true. For one, there are differing economic and cultural issues that many northern states have always felt should be left up to them and not southern states. Even on the matter of slavery, northern states advocated that they as states shouldn't be compelled to support slave states by helping slave states capture lost slaves.
That is true. The idea of states' rights goes back to the founding of the United States, when the framers of the Constitution sought to balance power between the federal government and the states. The issue of slavery did complicate matters, as southern states argued that they had the right to determine their own policies regarding slavery, while northern states argued that the federal government had the authority to regulate slavery in the territories. However, it is important to note that the concept of states' rights has often been used as a way to justify discrimination and oppression. For example, during the civil rights era, many southern states invoked states' rights as a way to resist federal desegregation efforts. So, while the concept of states' rights is an important part of the American political tradition, it has often been used to defend oppressive policies and practices.
I would like to point out that just because an idea has been used for bad purposes in the past doesn't mean the idea is necessarily bad in of itself. Just because oppressive states may have used it to justify racist practices doesn't mean that states' rights should forever be associated with bad faith actors.
That is a valid point. It is important to evaluate ideas based on their own merits and not solely based on how they have been used or associated with in the past. The concept of states' rights can be viewed in different contexts and may have different implications depending on the issue at hand. It is up to individuals and society as a whole to have open and honest discussions about the pros and cons of such ideas in order to make informed decisions.